Hello. Good afternoon. I've said it before, but I love this conference. It's great fun. But it's really quite daunting presenting to people who really know what they're doing. Anyway, so this is another new design for an old map. This is a piece of sort of ongoing work that I've been doing with my colleague, Professor William Cartwright from RMIT in Melbourne. And it's about paper map predominantly, so it's kind of the antithesis to what we've just seen, but contrary to popular belief, paper is not dead, at least not for the map that I'm going to talk about. So let's get into it a little bit. As many of you will know, I have a very unhealthy fetish for the London Underground map. It is my favourite map. It's a map that's synonymous with where I've lived for many, many years in my life. And I could do a whole story about this ridiculous thing that I did to my arm a couple of years ago. But that's for NACIS night out. More importantly, over the past few years, Bill Cartwright and I have been talking about this and publishing and presenting about our thinking about Harry Beck's London Underground map. And our broad view that while his ideas, though not necessarily original in and of themselves, because he borrowed from past work as well, it's been the model, or become the model for a lot of transit systems and subway systems around the world. But it doesn't necessarily stand up any longer for certain cities. And we published this paper in 2014 in the Cartographic Journal, where we were deliberately provocative. And that was our intent. We were trying to play devil's advocate to basically say the legacy and ongoing use and misuse and abuse of Beck's map has created problems for the way in which our cities have grown massively, yet still the same sort of maps appear to be used. And so we suggested that the current map of London Underground was no longer fit for purpose, and we ended with this call to action, basically. The conclusion we summed up in our critique was we need a fresh start, we need a reset of the London map to overcome many of the problems that the current map faces, rather than simply just repeating Beck's ideas. And I'll come back to this quote in a second. But let's have a look at the map. So this is the 1933 Harry Beck map of London. This has become known as a design classic. It's undeniably useful for navigation. It's schematicized. Interesting that we appear to be now going more geographical again. But there's a lot on here that we could talk about. Omission of detail, distortion of scale, color-coded to fit with a wider corporate design, straight lines, horizontal, vertical, 45 degrees, really designed not just as a design statement to show efficiency of movement in a really straight line and a very swift curve. And interestingly, diamonds were Beck's best friend at this particular point in time on the very first iteration of the map. It's a practical outcome as much as it's perhaps a brilliant design statement, in my opinion. And this is the current map. And I'm not going to rip it apart in public, but I think there's a lot wrong with it. And it's not just me that thinks this, it's very, very cluttered. It's lost its way in many ways. There's still elements that are retained and make it very much the map of London, you know, the colours and the typeface, the Johnson typeface and so on. But they've started to cram on so much information that the map becomes a lot less useful as an immediate route planning tool. So thinking about that statement that Bill and I put at the end of our paper, nobody actually took up the fight. So actually, yeah, we thought we'd have a go, you know. And of course, in the meantime, and you know, Ryan's just sort of prefaced this a little bit. You know, things are moving on a bit, and maybe the future map of London isn't going to be a schematic map. You know, this is actually the Google version, but it's ostensibly the same sort of product that we've just seen in Ryan's presentation. Although interestingly, I think he went between Buckingham Palace and somewhere, and I'm going between the London Eye and a pub. I don't know. And maybe the future of the tube map is no map. That's a discussion point for later. But it's not just London that's moving along these lines. I took this only a few weeks ago in New York, MTA, already going digital, but interestingly at the moment just putting the 1979 map on a digital screen, and all the problems of resolution because you can't read the labels properly. Okay, so if I want to redesign the London map, where do I start? Well, this is how Beck started in 1930. This was his original sketch diagram of the London Underground, and you can see what happened. He got his pencils out, and there's iteration after iteration, and erasing of lines and moving things around to fit it. And you can see him experimenting and constantly going through this design process. But with a massively increased network, what do? Just get a bigger piece of paper and repeat this process? No. I went to the local hardware store and I bought a large piece of wood and 800 nails. And I spent a considerable amount of time knocking 800 nails into a rectilinear grid on a piece of wood. And you're right, it was mad. And I didn't even get a nail gun. This was manual work. And they all had to be perfectly vertical because I'm a bit OCD like that. So then what do I do? Well, I went to the haberdashery store, I guess we'd call it, and I bought a load of thread. And of course, the thread had to be exactly the right colours because I'm a little bit that way as well. And I wanted a fresh start. Now, it's very difficult when you know that your view of the city is basically mediated by the map in your mind, not the geography, but the underground map in many ways is a Londoner's view of London. But I wanted to try and start fresh. So I began just thread through this series of nails. And the beauty of this was that I could start moving things, unraveling the thread and moving things around. You know, it's the equivalent of erasing a pencil line on a piece of paper, I guess. But it was a very physical process. It meant that I could rapidly redesign a certain part of the network. But I started with the central line, the red one that goes horizontal as an anchor, just like Beck did, and then started manipulating different lines around it as they were added temporally. And you know, you start to get into some detail. One of the key differences I wanted to establish was a better relationship between the above and the below ground detail. Beck very much said that you don't need to know what's above ground, you just need to know how to get from one node to another in the network. And I would argue these days that in many ways the geography is now becoming more important. You want to navigate between the London Eye and the Brewdog pub in Soho, right? You don't want to navigate between Westminster Station and Oxford Circus because you don't necessarily know that those two stations are the two stations you need. So I think the above ground context becomes increasingly important, particularly in a more complex network. And I also wanted to put the River Thames in as a real geographical feature, not a schematicized one. And that was just something I wanted to try to see whether I could do it. And after 30 hours, I ended up with this, which was basically a piece of wood this size with all these lines on it. And as I was building the map, I was becoming aware of something interesting, began to kind of excite me. There's diamonds everywhere on this map, and it was a nice little nod to perhaps Beck's first iteration. So, I won't bore you with this process, but there's a blog on the Esri website called How to Make a Transit Map in ArcGIS Pro, and I effectively brought the image in, a digital photograph, I georeferenced it over London actually, and then created a digital pegboard in the software and began to use my great and unmatched digitizing capability to recreate, that's a quote from somebody by the way, that's not my words, and basically translated the map into this. And you can start to see the diamond motifs coming through. Now it certainly looks a little bit like the London Underground map, but that's by design, right? It has to. It has to maintain some sort of sense of the place as well as be something a little bit new. But there's significantly fewer line change directions or changes in line direction. There's a similar density of line work, but there's now a strong central diamond motif with nested lines. There's less spaghetti. It's perhaps a little crisper, and this is me critiquing my own map now. It's still diagrammatic, but I would perhaps argue that it's maybe a little bit better balanced than the official map now. So let's take a closer look at some of the design decisions. So this is my new map. I've basically put in a lot of empty space, white space, negative space. So whereas I think Transport for London are adding to the map constantly, I'm trying to take away a lot and remove it. And I think that gives it that slightly crisper feel. There's no longer any huge, thick, black-cased interchange symbols. I'm just using a fill for a circle. I've retained the line colours because that's part of a corporate design and you're not going to change those easily. And I wanted to imply interconnectedness rather than to create this huge, great monstrosity of an interchange symbol. I've simplified some of the stations. I've added little walking symbols. If any of you have ever been to London, you know that actually you can walk it. You don't have to take the subway. Many stations are right next to each other, and it's quicker. And this is really the look that I came up with. Cased lines now allow separation from adjacent lines a little bit more easily. So in the top left, that's my central line. Compare that with the current map. The central line goes crazy vertical. It doesn't in reality. I compare perhaps the interchanges at a major station like Paddington, where a lot of lines come in and through the station, with the bottom right official version. I think it's cleaner. I think it's easier to see in terms of legibility. And perhaps the biggest monstrosity on the official map is Bank Monument Station, where I would challenge any of you to understand how to get through that particular station sensibly. And I think I've tried to negotiate the problems there. I think more than anything, just this process has demonstrated that we can be more elegant with a new, fresh look at a map, even if you don't like my version of it. I don't think we have to be stuck with what we have and just simply iterate that. We can actually come up with some fresh eyes and make a more elegant map. I did manage to get the River Thames into the map in its geographical position. So it gives the map maybe a little bit more of a sense of realism rather than just a stark schematic. And I carried the diamond motifs to the four corners of the map. Okay, let's veer into 3D just for a moment. Now let me be clear. I'm a little bit of a 3D skeptic. I think there's hardly any reason to go into 3D. But it doesn't mean to say you can't experiment. And I love this map. This is a map from 1995, which is actually about 8 feet tall, and was developed as more of a promotional piece than anything else. But it was interesting because, to me, it does the one thing that a schematic map of a subway doesn't do, which is relate that above-ground geography to the below-ground. Now, it's not without problems. We have perspective and occlusion and all the other stuff that comes with trying to just simply flip the world into 3D and expect everything to work. But when we now get a sense of the geography, and we now get a sense of the places that you might want to go between in terms of the real world, and not just arbitrary station names that happen to be historically named, not necessarily in relation to the above-ground detail. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just flip my map into 3D. There we go, nice and simple. And so Heathrow Airport is in the front, right at the front, at the bottom. I spent half my life there, so why not put it right in the middle, at the front? But, you get into the top, and everything's receding into the distance. So what do? Well, you just make it axonometric instead. So trust me, this is 3D, even though it doesn't look it. And what that allows you to do is begin to fill in some of the space with other information. Now, this isn't a new idea, it's just that I've very rarely seen this in relation to London's geography, but starting to add information into the map to show something about above-ground detail gives people an ability to navigate between places and not abstract tube names. So just zooming into that map gives a little bit of a sense of how these sort of axonometric buildings and landmarks sit within the map itself, alongside some parks and other detail. Now, there's some obvious difficulties, sometimes where lines actually cross and they're now tubes, they're real tubes for the tube line. They actually intersect, whereas perhaps there isn't an intersection because in reality they're different tunnels at different heights. So another iteration of this might be to actually separate lines vertically, but that's getting into a whole other level of complexity. But what you can do with your map is make it realistic. So how accurate is my 3D map? Well, I always try to go to look at solid reference illustrations for my maps, and as we all know, Pink Floyd's album Animals has a floating inflatable pig above Battersea Power Station, so my map has a floating inflatable pig over Battersea Power Station. You know, that's kind of interesting because that allows me to very casually go into the next slide, because there's always somebody willing to shoot down your map, and it's usually me. But as an aside, Pink Floyd's Piggy actually escaped its leash and did actually have to get shot down because it was going into the flight paths coming into Heathrow Airport. Anyway, so I present, we call this critique, okay, shooting down other people's maps. But you know, I presented this work at a conference in Vienna in May, interestingly, this guy took a little bit of offence to this. Now, the interesting about this is when I first printed the map out 2 weeks before the conference, the first thing I said, and I think Craig Williams was in the room as well, we both like, oh, type's too small, too late, it's got to go. So I already knew this mistake, but he didn't stop there. You know, he was pretty annoyed about this effort of my map. But I did actually send it to a lot of other people as well. I sent it to a guy called Cameron Booth, who runs the Transit Maps website, which is excellent if you haven't already looked at it. And I thought he made some very valid points, and so I reflected on some of these points, and I went back to the map. You know, I wasn't so stupid as to think, right, I've now made the next Beck. You know, that's my contribution to London. I've made the map. That would be ludicrous. So I went back and iterated it and came up with some modifications to the design. So I've now colour-coded the main interchange stations with blue symbol fills rather than everything being grey. I've enlarged the text significantly, at least 3 points bigger across the map, and the interchange stations are larger as well. I've changed the national rail symbols to be colour-coded in that way. I've made some corrections. I've repositioned a few things. And if you want to have a look at the slippy version of this, it's at that particular website. So iteration is a good thing. And it just so happens that I'm not the only one thinking like this. This is a little postscript. This is John Taranach, who created the 1979 MTA map in New York. And he's pretty annoyed about the fact that it's still used today, because he claims it's now inconsistent, illegible, and it lacks vital information. So even the makers of our maps from the past, you know, are critical of their own work, which I think we all should be. And there were some great quotes in this little piece that I read that I really did very much enjoy. Today's published map, you know, only shows daytime service, and the map maker's responsibility does not end at midnight. So I love that. And then the following two were great. You know, it's like, you should change the map. No, I should do it for you. Rehire me to make the map. So that's just a little journey through me making a map from wooden nails just to have another go at a new design for a map. And in summary, I think what Bill and I think we've done is made a pair of maps that at least shows that there can be a development of a design language for a very, very well-known and well-used network, and you can retain some aspects of it, but still come up with something inherently new for people to shoot down, as is their want. So that's the end of my little journey for today. Thank you very much.